What if the poverty of one continent isn't about its failures, but the direct result of another's success? For centuries, the story of Africa has been framed as a tale of charity cases and Western intervention, but that's not the whole story. It's not even the most important part. The real story is about how an entire continent's future was systematically stolen and then repackaged as progress. This isn't a story about what Africa lacks. It's a story about what was taken, and we're going to show you exactly how it happened. Section 1. The Why. A world of its own. Before we get to the theft, you have to understand what was there to be stolen. The popular version of history often starts with a dark continent, just waiting for Europeans to bring the lights. That narrative is a lie. It erases a vibrant and complex history. Long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, Africa was home to powerful and sophisticated civilizations. In modern-day Sudan, the Kingdom of Kush was a major regional power for over 1,000 years, even ruling Egypt as the 25th dynasty and leaving behind more pyramids than the Egyptians themselves. The Ghana Empire controlled vast trade routes, moving gold and salt across the Sahara. Its successor, the Mali Empire, became a global center of immense wealth and Islamic scholarship under rulers like Mansa Musa. To the south, Great Zimbabwe was a hub for gold and ivory, with trading connections stretching as far as China. From the bustling city-states of the Swahili coast to the intricate bronze work of the Kingdom of Benin, Africa was a continent of diverse and developing societies, all connected by extensive internal trade networks. These weren't static, isolated tribes. They were dynamic societies with evolving systems of government, farming, and commerce. But in the 14th century, a new force arrived, driven by a ferocious appetite for two things: resources and labor. Europe was kicking off its age of global expansion, and its own development was about to be fueled by the systematic underdevelopment of another continent. As the historian Walter Rodney famously argued, Europe and Africa entered a relationship where one partner would develop at the direct expense of the other. This wasn't an accident, it was a design. And the first stage of that design wasn't about land, it was about people. Europe's New World colonies needed a massive labor force for the sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations that were making European nations rich. The solution to this labor shortage was found across the Atlantic, and it would trigger the largest forced migration in human history, changing the destiny of both continents forever. Section 2. The How. The mechanisms of theft. So how do you steal a future? You do it in two phases. First, you steal the people who would build that future. Then you steal the resources they would have built it with. Part 1. The human cost. The transatlantic slave trade was much more than a human tragedy. It was a brutally efficient economic system. For over 400 years, European ships carried millions of Africans to the Americas. The process was devastating. It's thought that roughly 2/3 of those captured were men, and a huge percentage were women in their bearing years, the very core of any society's workforce in its future. The constant fear of capture created an atmosphere of lawlessness and violence, making long-term planning for things like farming or business nearly impossible in many regions. The slave trade fundamentally rewired Africa's economy. It incentivized conflicts, as some African rulers were forced or bribed into capturing and selling other Africans to European traders. Local economies that had been developing diverse forms of agriculture and manufacturing were now reduced to a single destructive export: human beings. Historians call this a monoculture based on the sale of people, and it stunted the growth of all other industries. While a few local elites might have profited, the vast majority of the wealth generated by African labor was funneled directly to Europe, fueling its industrial revolution. Think about it. The cotton picked by enslaved Africans in the Americas fed the textile mills in Manchester, England. The profits from slave-produced sugar funded the growth of European banks and industries. Africa's most valuable resource, its people, was used to build the prosperity of other nations, while its own development was put on pause. One academic study estimated that if the slave trades had not occurred, 72% of the income gap between Africa and the rest of the world today simply wouldn't exist. The continent's human capital was stolen, leaving behind chaos, political instability, and a demographic hole so deep it would take centuries to recover. Part 2. The resource grab. After centuries of profiting from African labor, the second phase of the theft began. By the late 19th century, Europe had abolished the slave trade, not just for moral reasons, but because capitalism had evolved. It now needed raw materials for its factories, and Africa was a treasure chest. What followed was the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, with 0 Africans in the room, European powers literally drew lines on a map, carving up the continent into colonies. These borders were completely arbitrary, lumping together rival ethnic groups and splitting apart cohesive societies, setting the stage for generations of future conflict. The entire purpose of these new colonies was extraction. Colonial powers did build some infrastructure, like railroads, but these lines weren't designed to connect African towns or create internal markets. On the contrary, they ran from the resource-rich interior straight to the ports to be shipped to Europe. It was a one-way flow of wealth. Africa's cocoa, rubber, diamonds, and timber flowed out, while expensive manufactured goods flowed in, often made from the very same materials Africa had just exported. This system was designed to create dependency. African farmers were often forced to grow cash crops like cotton or coffee for export instead of food for their own people, leading to devastating famines. Local industries that might have competed with European ones were actively shut down. Through forced labor and taxation, Africans were pushed into working in colonial mines and on plantations under brutal conditions. Colonial education wasn't meant to empower. It was designed to create a class of low-level clerks to help run the colonial machine. Any sign of local entrepreneurship or innovation was crushed to make sure African economies served only one master, the colonizer. The result was the total extroversion of African economies. They were rewired to serve external needs, not their own. This wasn't a failure to develop. It was active underdevelopment, a process where the economic structures of a continent were deliberately taken apart and repurposed for someone else's profit. This history is heavy, and it can be uncomfortable, but it's essential to understanding the world we live in today. If you're finding this video valuable for challenging the old narratives, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. It really helps us keep making content like this. And let us know in the comments, how does this history change your view of modern global inequality? The colonial era officially ended in the mid-20th century, but the economic and political structures it built are still here. The so-called progress that Europe brought was actually the construction of a system of permanent dependency. The political borders drawn in Berlin are, with few exceptions, still the borders of most African nations today, fueling ethnic and political instability. Economically, many African nations are still caught in the colonial trap, exporting cheap raw materials and importing expensive finished goods. They have little control over the global prices of their own resources, a weakness that was engineered centuries ago. The wealth that was extracted for over 400 years was capital that never got invested in African schools, hospitals, or institutions. It was the capital that built Europe and North America. To call this process progress is to accept the story told by the thief. It ignores the complex societies that came before, the catastrophic loss of human potential through the slave trade, and the deliberate rewiring of an entire continent for another's gain. It was a systematic dispossession, a theft of past achievements and future possibilities. The story of Africa's underdevelopment isn't a separate story from Europe's development. It's the same story, just told from the other side of the equation. And understanding that is the first step towards honestly addressing the inequalities that continue to shape our world.